When I started building, it wasn't because I wanted to build guitars. I was supposed to go to a classical guitar conservatory in Connecticut. Had my money in for my first semester, and I was using an Ovation steel string guitar. The Ovation factory was only like 20 miles from my house, so they were ubiquitous in that area. I had this Ovation guitar that was a steel string, and I had put nylon strings on it, and my guitar teacher at the time said, "You're not going to go to school with that guitar. They'll laugh you right out of there." He said, "You got to get a real classical guitar." And he says, and I happen to know a guy who just moved into this area who's a handmade guitar builder. And I didn't even know you could do that.
Yeah.
You know, I just thought everything was done in factories. And so I met this guy, and I gave him $300 to build me a classic guitar, Brazilian rosewood sides and back. Because back then you could get Brazilian rosewood for $25 a set, sides and back. Now it's like, $4,000 or $5,000.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to name his name here because we had our issues. But during the summertime, he was supposed to be building this guitar, and I'd go over to his place all the time. He lived pretty near where my parents' house was, and I'd go over there and go, "How's it going?" And he'd go, "Oh, well, here's where I'm at." And it was never at anywhere. He wasn't really doing it. And I said, "Well, how do you do this? How do you put the top together?" And he said, "Well, here's how you do it, and let me show you how to do it." And he made me do it. So I did that. And I said, "What's next?" And he goes, "Well, then you got to put the braces on." And he showed me how to put the braces on. By the end of the summer, I had built the whole thing myself.
Yeah.
Gave him $300, and he had me build the whole thing myself. And I was ready. I was going to I was so stoked to be able to have this nice instrument and go to school with it.
Yeah.
And I probably would have ended up as a professor of guitar somewhere and been totally unhappy, divorced 3 times. But when I started to walk out, he goes, "I like what you did. How would you like to work for me?" And I said, "What do you mean?" And he goes, "Well, you could be my apprentice. Some traditional European apprenticeship. You work for nothing, and I'll teach you everything I know."
Yeah.
And I went, "Hell yeah." So I got my money back from the school, and the next day I started working for him. And over the next 3 years, we were at different shops here and there, and I ended, the last one was in Massachusetts, up in Northampton. And it turned out that he was taking people's money and doing the same thing. He wasn't even having them build their own guitars. When the heat got to be enough, he would just move to another place.
Really?
He was a total con man, and he was 12 or 13 years older than me, and I was like 18 or 19. I was really impressionable, and I thought he had good intentions. His wife died a year after I met him. He had a lot of bad luck, but he also had a lot of not wanting to work kind of luck. And I ended up doing almost everything for him. Once in a while he'd show up to work, but I can remember him taking an $800 deposit for a guitar and buying a camera with it and just being gone all day out in the woods shooting stuff. And so in 1975, I had worked on a dozen guitars and a dozen dulcimers that were like 90% finished. And he had this new girlfriend that we were living in this 1-bedroom apartment in Northampton. And he goes, "Well," he says, I can't live in the same apartment anymore. I got this girlfriend now." And I said, "Well, that's okay. I'll move into the spare room in the shop." And he goes, not only do I have to live alone, but I have to work alone." And that's when the light bulb went off for me. I finally realized, this guy's going to fuck me over.
Yeah.
I had done all this work, and I thought that all these instruments were going to go to the people that I knew he owed money to.
Yeah.
And no, he was just going to scoop everything and finish them somewhere else and take all the money and continue on. So I said, "Okay." I said, "But I really have to I have no money, I have to have something." And he goes, "Well, finish one of the dulcimers and keep the money for it." That would have been about $75. And I was, "Yeah, okay. I have to you're the boss, I'll do that." So he went off to bang his girlfriend, and I had this friend in town who was teaching at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and I said, "Hey, I hear he borrowed $1,000 from you last week." And he goes, "Yeah." And I said, "Do you ever want to see that back?" And he goes, "Yeah." And I said, "Loan me your station wagon tonight. I'll bring it back in the morning." So he said, "Okay." So he loaned me his station wagon. I went into the shop. I took all the guitars and all the dulcimers and I brought them back to my parents' house where my dad had a little wood shop. And over the next month, I finished them all and I started handing them out to everybody that I knew that he owed them to. And years later, I was still finding other people that he had cheated.
Yeah.
You know, but I felt pretty good about it. He did not. He was very upset. I never saw him again, but I did, in the early part of this century, find a wanted poster from Chino Valley, Arizona, where he was wanted for domestic violence with a weapon and probation violations.
Yeah.
And they had his picture. I knew it was him. So what would he be now? He'd be 85 or so now. I'm not worried about him coming back for me. But,
that's pretty
you know, what goes around comes around. And I never felt bad about it. And I never felt ashamed for doing what I did.
Yeah.
He took a warrant out on me in Massachusetts for grand larceny. And it made me more careful every time I was in Massachusetts from then on that I didn't get pulled over for anything because, you know, I would have ended up in jail. But I still would have had plenty of people who would have said, no, this guy is the guy who should be in jail, not him.
Yeah.
So anyway, I moved to California trying to get away from that scene, and I hitchhiked across Canada and came down to San Francisco to visit a friend of mine in college down there, and that's when I ran out of money and I got the job at Alembic.
Yeah.
And after Alembic, I worked for Turner Guitars. Rick Turner was the president of the Alembic factory, and I always got along great with him. And he got pushed out of the Alembic scene and started his own company, Turner Guitars, which later became Renaissance Guitars. But when he started that, I started working for him. So he was a major mentor.
Yeah.
I guess, still not going to name the guy, but my first guy was a mentor too. But you know, he taught me just as much about what not to do as what to do. But I had some skills when I left him, so I'm grateful.
Yeah.
I'm grateful to him for, you know, doing that. So Rick Turner always let me, he would just say, I want this done, you know, here's kind of how you do it, you know, and he'd leave me to my own devices, he was a hands-off kind of mentor. But I had plenty of time to sharpen my skills when I worked for him. And then when he moved down to Los Angeles, I didn't want to go down there, so I messed around up here for a while making wood. Was working for a framing company for a little bit. I worked for an alarm company for a little bit with Doug Irwin, who made Garcia's Tiger guitar. Doug was a salesman at this alarm company.
Oh, okay.
I was an installer.
You've seen the news on that guitar lately.
Oh yeah. Well, when Garcia died, the band thought it was their guitar, and Doug had to sue them because Garcia wanted to leave it to Doug. So he had it for a while, and he sold it for $1 million, and somebody sold it to Jim Irsay for $2 million. And now at the Christie's auction, it went for like $13 million.
Yeah.
So you never know, you know.
Did you do the inlay on that guitar?
No, that was all Doug. That was all Doug. I've done copies for other people.
Yeah.
You know, that had to have something that looked like that. There's a lot of copycats out there. And after that, I went to work for Modulus Graphite when that started up with Jeff Gould. And I don't know if I would call Jeff a mentor because he pretty much let me alone and just knew that I knew what I was doing. So I had a lot of fun when I worked there at Modulus. But you know, I finally decided I just have to work for myself. So. And really, mentors are anybody that I talk to or get ideas from. Yeah. It's just, I incorporate practically everything I see or hear into what I do. My old friend Frank Fuller, who's used to work at Alembic and was my best friend for years, and he died. He was the guy who told me when you're cutting the shell, he says, you don't just cut it and then stop and then move everything and then cut it at another angle. He says, you move the shell at the same time you're cutting. Mm-hmm. And you move the blade at the same time you're moving the shell. And it's like a two-dimensional process where you really have to pay attention or you screw it up. Yeah. And that was a big deal for me. I had to learn how to do that. It made the curves a lot smoother. It made things go faster.
Yeah.
Get the good light on there. You know, I've got a dental light. I've got two dental lights that are very different. One of them's brand new and the other one's like 30 years old. But you got to have a lot of light on while you're doing it. So yeah, everybody that I talk to is, you know, teaching me something.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's what not to do.